There's this thing that happens sometimes in sports, especially when there's two rival teams, and amongst the fans anyways. So if I'm a fan of one team and the rival team has a star player and the star player gets hurt, comes down with some injury, a lot of times the fans, what do? Rejoice. I don't understand it really, because if you're going to play your rival team and you beat them, but their star player isn't playing, it's not really the same anyways. But it doesn't matter. You're going to the championship and that star player goes down and you're like, yes, now we'll win for sure. And it brings us to the point where we ask our question, should we be happy about this? I mean, somebody hurt himself, so it could even maybe ruin his career. Should we be happy about this? Well, not really. But sometimes we don't really respond well to things like that. Sometimes our attitude isn't just quite right. And we may not even realize, though, that you're celebrating that a bad thing has happened to someone. All you're thinking about is what good it might have brought you. All you're thinking is but this benefits me. Or maybe you're just being jealous and now you're happy that is out of the way and you're just being selfish. Well, we come to the beginning of 2 Samuel. And it would be very easy for us to read this first chapter of 2 Samuel with feelings of relief and maybe even joy. We could read this and then say, oh good, Saul is finally out of the way. I mean, David has been promised to be king. He's been waiting. He's been chased around. His life has been threatened. Saul is finally out of the way, and now David can finally become king. And now, while it's true that God's promises are coming to fruition, and David will soon be king, the tone of this chapter is not one of celebration. The tone of this chapter is actually one of sorrow and sadness. Israel has been defeated. Their king has received divine judgment for rebelling against God and is now dead. You see, Saul got what he deserved, but it leaves us with these mixed feelings, wondering, should we be happy about this? And as we read through this chapter, we'll see that David himself is not. We begin 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Now, as we begin this chapter, we're actually continuing the events that have happened previously in the end of 1 Samuel. Because actually, 1 and 2 Samuel are really the same book. It's just too long to fit on one scroll. So they just divided it up into two. And so really we're just continuing on the same events, the same story that we were reading in 1 Samuel. And so we read this though, and we read about the Amalekites, that David has gone and struck down the Amalekites. But when we read the Amalekites, we also might be reminded of a story of Saul and the Amalekites. We're reminded of Saul's failure when he rebelled against God. So it says David has just defeated the Amalekites. What happened was there was a raiding party when David and his soldiers, his men, were away from home. An Amalekite raiding party had come up and taken all of their people and all of their things and headed back to their land, to their territory. David found out. He chased them down, struck them down, and brought his wives and his families and all the people and all the stuff back home to Judah. But this never should have happened in the first place, because many years earlier, Saul had been told, God told Saul, go strike down the Amalekites. But Saul didn't fully obey. You could read that in 1 Samuel 15. You see, Saul only partially obeyed. And you might remember the story. Samuel came up to Saul and he says, "Why didn't you obey God?" And he goes, "I did. Look what I did." And then Samuel said, "Then what's that sound of animals I hear?" Because he wasn't supposed to bring any animals. He was supposed to destroy them all. And Saul started making excuses. He said, "Well, the men, they wanted to do it." And he said, "And also, we brought it back so we could sacrifice to God." And that's when Samuel said, "It's better to obey than to sacrifice." And it was that day that God rejected Saul as king. You see, Saul was king of Israel, God's representative in Israel, and he was to be completely obedient to God and to follow God, and he rebelled against God. So that day, God rejected him as king, and eventually, he would lose his kingdom. It would eventually bring his downfall. Well, now we move forward to 1 Samuel chapter 28. In 1 Samuel 28, the Philistines had come out to fight against Israel. And both armies, the Israelite army and the Philistine army, were camped out on opposite sides of the valley. And Saul looked out at the Philistine army. He saw the Philistines and he was scared. And at that point, in his fear, he decided he was going to consult God. In other words, he was going to go to ask God, "What should I do? How should we fight this battle?" And so, but the thing is Saul had not consulted God for a long time. Saul had not been talking to God. Saul had not been following closely after God. Saul was living in rebellion against God. His relationship with God, he was not right with God. And when he goes to consult God and ask, "What should we do?" God doesn't answer him. See, we need to realize that Saul was a man who had turned his back on God, who had unconfessed sin in his life. But now he's expecting God to ignore all that and to answer his cry for help. What Saul ought to have done was to confess his sin, to repent and get right with God, and come to God with a right heart. But when God doesn't answer Saul, he gets really desperate. And what's he do? What's he tell his men? "Go find me," do you remember? A medium, a witch. He goes to the witch of Endor. "Go find me a medium, a fortune teller." And they say, "Oh, we know where one is," and they take him there. And when he goes there, they go and he says, "I want you to bring up Samuel for me." And somehow when we studied this, we said somehow it happened. Samuel actually came up and he talked to Saul. And Saul said, "Tell me what to do." And what was Samuel's response? "If God isn't talking to you, why would I? If God isn't giving you advice, why would I?" But then Samuel does say something to Saul. He says, "Tomorrow you will die, you and your sons." So then in chapter 31, the battle is raging. The people are fighting. And Israel flees from the battle. I'm actually going to turn there, chapter 31, and I want to read for you verses 2 to 5. It says, "And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul." So at this time, his sons are all dead. Saul is still alive, but he's being chased down. Verse 3, "The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him." In other words, he got hit with arrows, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." See, Saul is afraid of being tortured to death. He's wounded. He knows he's going to die. He's not going to make it. And he doesn't want the enemy to capture him. So he says to his armor bearer, "You kill me." Because at least that way he'll get a nice killing. So he says, "You kill me." Well, look at the armor bearer's response. But his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. In other words, he knew it was wrong to do. Therefore, Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. He killed himself. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. So that's the end of Saul. He is dead. And that brings us back to 2 Samuel chapter 1, where Saul's death is reported to David. Let's read, beginning in verse 1 again. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." So this man who had been with the Israelite army comes to David. Now the distance he had to travel was about 80 miles, so it took him a few days to get there. But he gets there to David, and it says that his clothes were torn and there was dirt on his head. Now you could read that and it could simply suggest that he's been in battle. But more likely, it's talking about him being in mourning. See, this is what people did when they went into mourning. They would tear their clothes, they would throw dirt up in the air onto their heads. It was a sign of sorrow, a sign of grief, a way of expressing that grief. So most likely he had seen the Israelite army be beaten, and he had seen these deaths, and he was in mourning, and he tore his clothes that way. Now the question is this true mourning, or is he putting on a show for David? We'll see, maybe. But when he arrives in this condition, it mirrors something that happened many years earlier. When he comes, in fact, I'm going to turn back. 1 Samuel chapter 4. We read almost the exact same words. 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 12. It says, "A man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and with dirt on his head." The situation there was when Israel had gone to battle with the Philistines again. But they were struggling, and they decided, let's take the Ark of God with us into battle. They treated the Ark of God like a good luck charm. And if we have the Ark with us, we can't fail. They took the Ark into battle, and what happened? They got beat. The Ark was captured by the Philistines. They took it, and Eli, who was the priest, his sons had taken the Ark into battle. His sons were killed. This man, this messenger who ran back to them, got back to Eli and told him what had happened. Eli fell off his chair and broke his neck and died. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's a lot of similarities between these two events. In both instances, there is a servant of God who has not been faithful. And this is significant. In both instances, there has been promised judgment. And in both cases, that judgment has been brought about. There has been death. So back in 2 Samuel 1, though, this man comes and he bows down before David, showing submission to David. But his appearance causes David to ask him, "Where are you coming from?" And he says that he was with the camp, or he escaped from the camp of Israel. In other words, he was with Israel at the battle, and he escaped from the battle. Now, this is kind of an ominous answer. What does that mean? It doesn't sound good. And David, remember, doesn't know anything about what's been happening. He was off fighting his own battle and has come back home. And now this man shows up with this news. He doesn't know what's happening, but it doesn't appear to have gone well. So he demands that the man tell him the whole story. And so the man tells him that Israel has been defeated, that many people have died, including Saul and Jonathan. Now let's think about this man again. This man who's bringing the message. He understands, he knows about David and his situation. He knows about David. I mean, he knew where to go find David. So he knows David's living out there, how he's at odds with Saul. He knows the situation. He knows that David will become king, has been promised by God. And so he expects that when David hears this news, that he will take this as good news, that he will be happy about it. I mean, Saul is dead. The throne is now vacant. David can take it. But David's interest in this battle, his reason for asking about how things went, is out of concern for Israel, not out of opportunistic feelings. He's not thinking, yes, is it finally time? He's actually saying, what happened with Israel? He's concerned for them. Look at verse 5. Then David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? You see, David wants to know how he's so sure. I mean, are you certain that Saul and Jonathan are dead? Could he be just assuming this? I mean, the battle went poorly. We all ran away. I just assume Saul and Jonathan are dead. Or does he know for sure? So he asks him, is this really true? How do you know? Look what his answer is. Verse 6. And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. That's when he's wounded. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. So the man answers him. And of course, what he tells David is not exactly what happened. I mean, we read in chapter 31 what actually happened. That's how it actually went down. But this man tells a different version of the story. Why? Because he's lying. He's trying to gain favor with David, who will be the new king. And so he tells David, well, I just happened to be up on Mount Gilboa. That's where Saul was. That's where he had been wounded. And I just happened to be there. Now, we don't know if this man actually saw the interchange between Saul and his armor bearer. You know, when Saul told his armor bearer, kill me, and the guy said no, and then Saul committed suicide. We don't know if this guy actually saw that interaction, or if he just came upon him later and looked at it and said, oh, you could tell what happened. He's got arrows in him, and he's on his own sword. He killed himself. And so we don't know exactly how it all came down. But he may have just shown up there, discovered him laying there dead, taken the crown, taken the armband off his arm. But either way, he took the crown. He took the armband off of Saul's arm, markings that showed he was the king. And he ran off to find David. And after he had left, the army of the Philistines came along and they found Saul's body and said, hey, look, it's Saul. And they cut off his head. They took his armor, as it says in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. Well, let's keep reading verse 11. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And so did all of the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So David and his men, their immediate response is to start mourning. In fact, we're told here that they mourned and wept and fasted. This is the only time where these three words are all used together in the Old Testament. The writer is piling up these verbs to show the depth of his mourning, the depth of his sorrow. David is truly distraught here by the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. And for all of Israel, many had been killed that day, and the entire nation had suffered loss. Now, when David started mourning from this news, did that surprise you? I'm sure it surprised the man who brought the message. I mean, Saul had been trying to kill David. He'd been chasing him around multiple times, tried to kill him. David had been promised, you will be king. But he couldn't be king as long as Saul was alive. The only thing standing in the way was Saul. And so the man expected David to be happy. He thought he was bringing good news. Now, there may have been some positive things that would come as a result, but this was not good news. The interesting thing is you just see David's character here. He's not like opportunistic and just overjoyed at, yes, now I can finally win. He's sorrowful about the loss of Saul. So this man, I don't think he was expecting David's reaction, and I'm sure he wasn't really expecting what comes next. Look at verse 13 through 16. And David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner and Amalekite. David said to him, how is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. You see, the man had said that he had killed Saul. David doesn't know, David doesn't just immediately put him to death. Here's the interesting thing. David is not making a rash decision. He asks him two questions. The first question is, where do you come from? And when he asks this, he's not asking, where did you just come from? We already asked that question. He knows he came from battle. He's asking, where do you come from? Meaning, what is your nationality? Where do you live? You see, he's asking this question. He's trying to figure out if this man knew better than to attack the Lord's anointed, than to attack God's chosen servant. The man answers him. He says, I'm an Amalekite. He says he's an Amalekite who's living in Israel. His answer is his father is a foreign resident of Israel, a sojourner from Amalek. But that means that this man has grown up in Israel and would know better than to attack God's anointed, God's chosen servant. His second question is actually a rhetorical question. He says, how is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? In other words, what he's asking or saying to him is, you knew better. Why weren't you afraid to do that? The point is, you should have been. He should have been afraid. It was wrong to do. I mean, think about this. Even David himself did not kill Saul when he had the opportunity on more than one occasion because it was wrong. He knew he had the promise, but he also said God's going to do it in his time, in his way. So David tells the young man with him to execute this man who brought the message. David doesn't know that the man lied, but he's based his decision, the sentence, on the man's own testimony. I killed him. Now here's something interesting. This command that he gave, execute him, is the same command that was given by Saul once. But in Saul's situation, it was very different. Saul made the command to execute God's priests at Nob because he thought that they were siding with David, committing treason against him. And all Saul could think about was himself. And if they're not with me, they need to be put to death. The priests were innocent, but Saul had them killed anyway. And then we come here, in David's situation, he gave the command out of loyalty to Saul. He did it because he was wanting to do what was right. David was promoting justice, not doing it for selfish reasons, but for justice. Now, before we move on, I just want to talk for a minute about lying. As we see in this man's case, this man came and lied to David. So I want to talk about lying to try to get ahead. This guy tried it. Of course, he failed. But many people do this. Lie to try and get ahead. People often lie in order to better their situation or to get away with something, doing something wrong. And when you lie, it often comes back to bite you. But you may be able to get away with some things sometimes. You may actually tell a lie and be able to deceive people and think you're getting away with it. But I just want to remind you that you can't fool God. One way or another, lies come back to you. Paul wrote in Galatians 6:7, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap." Well, back to chapter 1. Saul and Jonathan and many Israelites are dead. Israel has been defeated. And David writes a lament. Look at chapter 1, verse 17 and 18. "And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said, 'It should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar.' He said," now let me stop there. A lament is a poem or a song that expresses grief and sorrow. And this one also eulogizes Saul and Jonathan somewhat. But the wording here, and if you have different translations as I read, you may have noticed it's a little different. The wording in the original Hebrew in verse 18 is a little strange. So it's caused some different translations. It's particularly with the word "the bow." In fact, in the ESV, which I read from, it doesn't even translate the words for some reason. It probably because they didn't know what to do with them. But they just don't even have the words "the bow." The King James Version says they need to teach the people how to use the bow. Now it's talking about a bow like a bow and arrow. And most modern translations say that teach them this lament called the bow. And I think that's most accurate. It's the title of the lament. The title of the poem or the song is "The Bow." And so they were to teach all of Judah or all of Israel. It would become like a national song. So let's look at David's lament. Chapter 1, verse 19 says, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen." You might recognize that little phrase, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." It's become kind of a proverb, but a lot of times it's said kind of tongue-in-cheek nowadays. But he's being serious. The mighty have fallen. You see, David here, he's talking about the mighty or the glory of Israel, both refer to Saul and Jonathan. He's talking about how they were mighty warriors. They were strong men, and they were the heroes of Israel. The glory of Israel, they were heroes of Israel. But they fell. They were killed in battle on Mount Gilboa, the high places. Verse 20. "Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult." Now Gath and Ashkelon are Philistine towns, or were Philistine towns. And when the news of Saul's death and of the victory over Israel got back to Philistine territory, it would spread like wildfire. They would celebrate. They would cheer. They would gloat over the downfall of Israel's king and his sons. They will revel in this victory over Israel, their great enemy. And no doubt they would revel that they had victory over Israel's God. And David is saying this is a terrible and shameful thing. And so David laments, don't tell them. Don't let them celebrate. Because a terrible thing has happened. Don't let them know. Now the fact is, the Philistines did celebrate. In fact, when they found Saul's body, they stripped his armor, they cut his head off. They took his body back to one of their cities and hung it on the wall of the city. They put him on display to say, look, we beat you. We killed your king. Verse 21. You mountains of the Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offering. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. Now David he's turning to the place where Saul and Jonathan died. Their bodies and their shields laid on the ground of the mountain. And the lament speaks as if it's a curse is being called down on that mountain. He says, let there be no dew or rain. And if there was no dew or rain, then the mountain would not be fruitful. It would not produce crops or fruit. And there were actually a lot of crops and trees on the mountain. But he says, let it not happen. Then the next two verses focus on Saul and Jonathan themselves. Verse 22. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely in life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Now, David speaks of two things here specifically. He speaks of their relationship, Saul and Jonathan's relationship to each other, and their military prowess. He says that they were inseparable. They were inseparable in life. Now, think about this. Even though Jonathan disagreed with his father's treatment of David, even though he disagreed with a lot of things that his father did, and Jonathan even tried to protect David as much as he could, Jonathan fought side by side with his father. He never abandoned him. He never deserted him. He never left him. They were inseparable in life. And then they even died together. And then he says that they were great warriors. And David uses picturesque language about how Jonathan's bow and Saul's sword were effective weapons. It says they did not turn back from the blood of the enemies. In other words, they worked. They did their job. They hit their mark. They didn't miss. When these weapons were used, the enemy was killed. And he also compares them then to eagles and lions, saying that they were fast, they were strong. In other words, Saul and Jonathan, mighty warriors. Verse 24, you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Earlier, he didn't want the daughters of the Philistines to rejoice over Saul's death, but now he speaks to the daughters of Israel. He tells the Israelite women to mourn him. And then what he suggests that Saul had given them good things. Now, this may refer to some expensive gifts that he lavished upon some of these women, or simply that he provided security and prosperity in Israel. But either way, they should mourn the death of their king. And then verse 25. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. Now this is interesting. David had told the women of Israel to mourn for Saul. But now he takes up the mourning for Jonathan himself. For Jonathan, he says, I'll lament him. I'll do it. You see, Jonathan was his close and loyal friend. And he honors Jonathan with this special praise. Now, his statement about Jonathan's love has been twisted by some to try and say they had a homosexual relationship. That is not what David is saying here. He's simply speaking about how great their friendship was. You see, Jonathan's unswerving loyalty to David, in spite of the fact that he knew that David would take the crown that would have belonged to him if it wasn't for David. It would be passed down to Saul's son, Jonathan. In spite of the fact that he knew that David would take the crown rather than himself, Jonathan's unswerving loyalty to David was more special or significant than any romantic love David had experienced with a woman. But as we read through this chapter and this lament, the thing that stands out in this passage is actually David's character. He's not celebrating the downfall of Saul, who treated him badly and who he was to replace as king. He's not thinking about the opportunity that just opened up to him. He's not being selfish or self-centered and thinking only of himself. Rather, he's thinking about the great loss that Israel as a whole has experienced. He's mourning the downfall of God's servant, even if that servant wasn't doing what was right. The funny thing is that Saul got what he deserved, but that wasn't reason for celebrating or gloating. It wasn't something that we should be happy about. And this idea, it's still true. When a servant of God rebels and is disciplined, it's a sad day. Even if he or she gets exactly what he or she deserves. It's sad. Now, sometimes Christian leaders fall. For whatever reason, maybe they got too big and it went to their head and then they made bad choices. Or maybe they just got overly tired and made a rash decision and they just blew it. But sometimes Christian leaders make bad decisions. Sometimes Christian leaders fall. Whatever the reason, they did wrong. But I have seen other Christians then look at those situations and gloat over their fall, or gloat over they got what they deserved. Maybe it's because they don't like something about that leader. Maybe they were arrogant, or they thought something about, they didn't like something about him. Or maybe they were just jealous because that person had a following and they didn't. But when one of God's servants falls, it's a sad thing. It's not funny and it's not satisfying. A servant of God has gone down. Your brother or sister in Christ has gone down. Should we be happy about this? I've also seen this kind of attitude about other churches. Maybe it's the new church in town or the big church in town. And the attitude is like, oh, well, they're cutting into our territory. As if we're in some kind of competition, which we're not. We're in this together. But then someone hears that one of these churches is having problems, or the church is split. And the thoughts that people have, or maybe even the words that some people speak are, maybe we'll get some of their people. That's not right. Should we be happy about this? When these types of things happen, we should actually mourn. We should pray for them. Let me close. I just want to read the words of Dr. Chisholm, one of my seminary profs, because he sums this up very well. He wrote this: "In the end, the demise of God's rebellious servants is to be lamented because it shatters God's ideal for the individual, often causes innocent people to suffer as well, and brings shame to the entire covenant community." Do we have the right attitude about our fellow Christians? Sometimes we may need to ask ourselves, should we be happy about this? I know I have. There have been times when I've asked myself, should I be happy about this? Maybe my first response was, I shouldn't be happy about this. But in the end, we want to be godly. We want to have godly character. We want to think like God. We want to know His heart and live so He is honored.